So I started making sourdough bread a few years ago, 2023, I think. So yes, I was late to the pandemic bread making trend, right? Everybody else had already done it, moved on. But I'm always late to the party. So for me, it was really just more of a personal science experiment. So I just wanted to see if I could get starter to grow, right? Because I was genuinely intrigued by this idea of capturing bacteria from the air and then growing yeast from it. Like it just blew my mind. But if you've ever made sourdough, you'll realize how uncomplicated the recipe is, right? It's just flour, water, salt, and then starter, which is just more flour and water. There's no kneading if you're lazy like I am. There's no complicated timing, again, if you're lazy like I am. I just basically mix it, ignore it, fold it a few times, and then stick it in the fridge, and then just ignore it some more, and then just bake it whenever I'm ready. That's it, right? That's my bread. But every single time I pull a loaf out of the oven, I think it's the best bread I've ever eaten. Like legitimately better than any bread I've ever bought from the grocery store. But yeah, that might be my ego too. And I'm thinking to myself, is my bread actually better, or is it just better because I made it? Because I think there's something happening there that goes way beyond my bread. And yes, I'm going to bring this back to branding like I always do, because there's a piece of this that has real implications for how you show up on social media, especially if you're active on Instagram or Pinterest. So stick around, okay? I want to make sure we get to this. Hang in there. First, I want to share a story about General Mills and the Betty Crocker brand. So fair warning, this is one of those rabbit holes that I went down during research, because the version of the story that gets passed around in marketing circles turns out to be more myth than fact. So the real story, I thought, actually was more interesting. But in the late 1940s, the company behind the Betty Crocker brand launched the instant cake mix. It was in a box, right? It had everything you needed to bake a cake. And you just poured it into a bowl, added water, stirred a little bit, and pretty much baked it. So for a while, this was a great product, and it worked. Between 1947 and 1953, sales of cake mixes doubled. But then something happened, and the sales weren't growing anymore. So they brought in a psychologist named Ernest Dichter, which, side note, he's also credited with inventing the focus group. But they brought him in to understand what was happening with consumers. So part of the reason for the flat line in sales was that the product had a genuine problem. The dried eggs in the mix produced cakes that stuck to the pan. They had poor texture, and they kind of tasted off. So General Mills made a practical fix, right? They removed the dried eggs and asked bakers to add fresh ones, which honestly made a better cake. But in order to get sales back up, it wasn't quite as simple as that. What Dichter found was that housewives that he interviewed felt that using a mix was cheating. And it didn't really feel like they had made it themselves. And there was real guilt associated with using these cake mixes. It felt like a moral and emotional imperative to bake a cake from scratch back then. So what followed was super interesting. So armed with this new information, General Mills knew they needed to reposition the cake mix product. So a bunch of ads and magazine articles started to appear in various publications telling homemakers that the plain cake layer was, and I love this phrase, merely step number one, right? The real art was what came after the cake was baked, right? So it was the frosting and the decoration and the creative finishing touches that put your own label on it, right? Which I find kind of funny, because it's like, who needs a cake that tastes good? You got a ton of sugar to cover it all up, right? But anyway, so the cake mix became a hit, not because the product got phenomenally better, right? But by shifting the focus of the cake baking process to the frosting and the embellishments that come after the cake is baked. Women now felt like they had contributed a genuine amount of effort to the result, right? And they felt a sense of ownership of that again. And maybe it wasn't completely from scratch, right? But it was pretty, and it took a lot of work, right? And that insight, that people need to feel like something belongs to them, that their participation in the process is meaningful, that's what I find truly fascinating here, because what actually shifted wasn't the cake recipe in the box, right? It was what making it meant. The participation and the ownership moved entirely into the frosting, into the finishing, into the part that had nothing to do with the flavor. It had maybe a little bit to do with technique, but nothing to do with the cake itself, really. In a weird way, baking a cake became sort of an arts and crafts project. And then there was research done decades later that sort of confirmed this idea, where researchers from 3 separate universities ran a series of experiments. They had people assemble IKEA furniture, they had people fold origami, and they had people build with Lego. And then they asked how much they'd pay for what they'd made. And people were willing to pay 63% more for the things they built themselves, even when those things were objectively worse, kind of like my sourdough, than the professionally made version. And they call this the IKEA Effect, and you may have heard of this. When effort creates ownership, and ownership changes how much we value something. But check this out. When I kept going down this rabbit hole, I found something that's related to ownership, but is actually a little different thing entirely. And this is where it gets really interesting for brands. Because if you have customers who are genuinely advocating for you, sharing your products, talking about you publicly, you'll want to listen closely to this. So there's a study that looked at what happens when people save or share products they're interested in on social media. And this finding was a trip. For the record, this data comes from just a single well-designed peer-reviewed study from 3 major universities, and I'll make sure to link it in the description. But what they learned is when someone posted a product publicly, for instance, like they posted about it on their Instagram or their TikTok, or anywhere where their followers could see it, their desire to actually buy that product went down. Let me say that again. It went down. But when they saved that same product privately to a board on Pinterest or a wish list that was private, that only they could see, their desire for that product went up. So when no one else knows yet, the wanting and the imagining that it could be yours keeps building, right? It's the same product, but it's the completely opposite effect, just based on whether anyone else could see it. So this is what's known as identity signaling. And I'm going to take a hot minute with you to help you understand this because it's pretty wild. So we use products to signal who we are, not just to other people, but to ourselves as well. The brand you choose, the gear you buy, the aesthetic you save to a board on Pinterest, right? While you're scrolling your mind off at midnight, all of it is communicating something about your identity, even when no one else can see it. Here's how that seems to work though. When you post something identity relevant publicly, when you share it, when you say, hey, I want this out loud to other people, right? That need for that thing gets satisfied. That signal has been sent and the desire to actually buy it goes down. But when you save it privately, that's totally different. You're not signaling anything to anyone. You're still trying it on. You're still imagining the identity you are building after purchasing this product, right? You're still in the gap between who you are right now and who you might be becoming once you buy this thing. And in that gap, the desire for that thing keeps growing. And I was thinking, well, maybe this is just for like Louis Vuitton purses or other fancy products that tell the world, hey, I'm super cool and I have taste and status, right? But this doesn't just apply to status brands, right? Like luxury products or high-end goods or things with obvious status value. The research suggests that this effect is much broader than that. It applies to any product or service that feels identity relevant, right, to the person considering it. And that could be anything, right? So it depends on the person. That could be a coaching program. It could be a homemade product. It could be just a brand whose values feel like yours, right? If someone sees themselves in what you offer, if it connects to who they're trying to become, which is kind of what we're trying to do here, right? Then what we're talking about applies to that. And if you watched any of my previous videos, the elements of value pyramid is worth revisiting here because identity signaling lives in the emotional tier of that pyramid. This specific value is what we call the badge or status value of a product or service, right? It conveys status, prestige, or a sense of belonging by owning or engaging with the product or the service. And the brands that provide products and services at that level that connect us who someone is becoming, not just what they need today, right, tend to build something more durable than the ones that compete purely on function or price. But here's where it gets even more wild. And trust me, this is the part you don't want to miss because everything we just talked about suggests that building an identity relevant brand is powerful, and it is. That's totally true. But as a brand, your first instinct is probably to celebrate, right? That someone posted your product to social media. Someone's talking about you, right? They're talking about your products. It's engagement. Woohoo, right? That's exactly what you want, right? But maybe not. Diving even deeper into the study, I learned here's where timing matters. And what the researchers found is that the worst thing you can do after someone posts publicly about your product is bombard them with ads. That's what Lauren Gruhl said. She was the key researcher on this study. And those were her words, because that person just satisfied their identity signaling need. They're not in that gap anymore. That desire is completely snuffed out. But she says that's temporary. Whoa. Because the research also found the effect fades after about a week or two. But anyway, so the smarter move to do here, right, according to the research, is wait. Give the desired time to rebuild before you follow up. So no DMs until the right amount of time has passed. So crazy. And the deeper implication here that I think matters more for how you think about your brand is that the backfire effect only happens when a product is framed as identity relevant. So as something that signals status or who you are. So when the same product is framed around what it actually does or the problem it solves, maybe its practical value, its function, the effect disappears, which puts brands in an interesting position because building identity relevant brands that stand for something and that connect emotionally, that's the goal, right? But this research is a good reminder that it's a double-edged sword, apparently. And the more identity relevant your brand is, the more carefully you have to think about how and when you show up and making sure you're also leading with the problem you solve rather than the status it will give you is part of handling that with care. So there's some nuances here. And I want to stop and address the elephant in the room here. Everything I've been describing, psychological ownership, identity signaling, the way desire builds in private, this is all human psychology. And as fascinating as it is, I think it's worth being fully aware of the territory you're operating in. Whether you're running a product-based business, a service business, or you're the brand, this applies to you. Because marketing, whether we're comfortable with this or not, operates in psychological territory. All of it, right? All of it. Your content, your pricing, your visual choices, the way you respond to people, all of it is weaving in and out of human psychology, whether you intend it to or not. And that deserves its own acknowledgement because you have a choice about how you operate within that territory, right? You can choose to operate from a place of genuine respect for the people you're trying to reach. And I think the brands that make that choice deliberately and with intention are creating something different than the ones who are just building the plane while flying it and moving fast and not worrying about the ethical ramifications. So I feel like the question you need to be constantly asking is this: are you using your understanding of human psychology to build something that genuinely serves the customer's experience? Or are you using it to bypass their better judgment and extract a transaction? I'd love to know if any of this resonated with you as a consumer or as a brand. Have you noticed yourself saving something privately and feeling more drawn to it over time, or maybe posting it publicly and like going, meh, don't need that? I'm super curious. Really, I'm super curious. And if you want to go deeper on where your brand creates value, specifically at that emotional and aspirational tier we talked about here, I cover the elements of value in my Brand Explorer workshop. It's the Know What You Do module, and it walks through exactly where your product or your service sits on that pyramid. And I'll link that workshop below. So that's it, kids. Go and have a beautiful day.